we saw a 6-fold difference there in that the odds that you would get a new lupus diagnosis with our test was 6-fold greater than it was with the conventional testing approach, which goes to show that the test, we've demonstrated in a series of studies, is more sensitive, more accurate for lupus diagnosis. This is then kind of taking the next step and showing that when clinicians use the test, it actually does translate into clinical decision making in terms of making a diagnosis. On the other hand, we also showed that when it came to treatment decisions, that the patients with the AVISE test were 3 times more likely to start a lupus medication than those who tested positive with the conventional approach. So it also was showing up in the way that patients were being managed.
Welcome back to the MedTech 101 podcast. And today I've got an exciting company, quite different from all the electrical stuff that we normally talk about. But this is still something that we still classify as a medical device of some sort, using tests, etc., for diagnostics, prognostic purposes and monitoring. And today I'm joined with Taylor O'Malley, and he is the Associate VP for Clinical Affairs and Market Access at a company called Exagen, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it's quite exciting, really, because the company is listed on the Nasdaq. I think it's on the New York Stock Exchange. So if anyone is interested after this podcast and go look at their stock price, feel free, you can go and buy some stock. But yeah, without really delaying a lot of time, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, great to be here on the podcast with you, and excited to share what I can about Exagen and some of the work that we're doing to help aid clinicians in the management and diagnosis of autoimmune rheumatic diseases.
Cool. Thank you very much, and apologies for mispronouncing your name. I think just how the differences as well between like UK pronunciation and American pronunciation sometimes gets me twisted up. But yeah, talking about the work you're doing, before we even get started into what Exagen is about and what you guys are doing there at work, I know you've done quite a bit of stuff. So could you give us just a quick, background information leading up to where you are right now and how you've been? Because I know you've spent about 11 years at the company. And you started in research, and now it's like you've kind of evolved at the company slowly towards sort of like you've moved away from the lab and you're kind of more like client facing now. So how can you please tell us how that journey has been for you?
Sure. My background is in biology with a particular focus on biochemistry. So I've always been interested in sort of how physiology works at sort of a molecular level. And during my time when I was an undergrad, I had the opportunity to work in a graduate lab at Georgia Tech, specifically a bioengineering lab that was focused on the lymphatic system. So that was a really interesting learning experience. Really piqued my interest in terms of, research and really hands-on kind of application. So had the chance to do a lot of lab work while I was there and learned quite a bit. Following that experience, I had the opportunity to join Exagen when it was a very small company, probably about 50 or 60 employees at the time. It was very much sort of in startup mentality, and trying to do something that not a lot of companies have had a lot of success with, which is to develop novel proprietary diagnostic testing for autoimmune rheumatic conditions like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and some others. And as you mentioned, initially I started out working as a research associate in the lab, was doing some basic assay development, validation studies, demonstrating that our tests were, precise and accurate for the different things that they were measuring. Over time, I became increasingly interested not just in sort of the lab science, but also the clinical science behind it, and understanding, how this information is interpreted by clinicians, how it's useful to them in making clinical decision making, And so eventually I, started to learn clinical trial, administration, how it's set up, how you, interface with institutional review boards, and ultimately how you carry out the research all the way to a peer-reviewed publication, be that a scientific abstract or a, full-blown scientific paper. So that's kind of in a nutshell the journey, but obviously a lot of things have transpired in those 11 years or so.
Nice, nice. No, that's really good to hear. And I think one thing you didn't mention there is that not only has Exagen grown, but I think I was quickly doing some quick research, and I think last year you just made shy of $50 million in revenue. So that also shows the growth of the company, and it's quite exciting, really, because it's no longer really a startup. When you start hitting those numbers, well, some companies will still consider themselves a startup, but you guys also IPO'd, so you listed. So it's quite grown in such an amazing way. And I think one thing that's quite interesting always, because I also started in research and I always wanted to talk with people. And that's what led to like this podcast as a way to just get out of the lab, get interact with people and stuff. And so I really understand the journey you've taken, and I think it's quite admirable, and it's been a really great place for your career as well. So it also explains why you've stayed there like all these years, which is also an indication of a good company. But but I know you did some interesting work as well, which I think it's just good for us to get it out of the way, like the lupus study. Like, what could you tell us about that? Because I think it's quite fascinating.
Sure. So, Exagen, we have some proprietary lab tests that we've developed here at the company over the past decade or so. Specifically, some of these tests they're known as cell-bound complement activation products, or CB-CAPs, and these are novel biomarkers for lupus that are more sensitive than conventional lupus biomarkers, which are mostly made up of autoantibodies or antibodies that react to something normal in the body, or should be normal, but the immune system has an abnormal reaction against it. And the CB-CAPS technology has been a very interesting journey, just understanding what it takes to kind of change the paradigm in diagnostic testing. How, after many decades or so, lupus testing has become, very routinized in terms of its, the conventional set of biomarkers that are typically measured. This is, sort of disruptive in a sense, in that we're bringing forth something new. We have to convince folks that there's significant data that shows that these biomarkers are better than what's currently available. And so that's led us through a series of publications that I've had a part in over the past decade or so, about 15 or so in total. But the most recent one, I think, is the one that you're referencing, where we did sort of a population level study looking at our test, which is known as Avise Lupus, where we take these CB-CAPs, or proprietary biomarkers, we integrate them with the conventional lupus biomarkers in a diagnostic algorithm that helps inform on the risk that a patient has lupus, that again, sort of outperforms what the conventional biomarkers offer by themselves. And so we took data from a integrated electronic medical record system that had about 23,000 patients tested with our test, and about 22,000 patients tested with a conventional approach. And we did sort of a direct comparison between these two populations to look at the degree to which the testing, whether it was the Avise test or whether it was the conventional approach, actually informed and led to clinical management decisions on the part of the clinician. So in one context, we looked at, when patients tested positive with the Avise test, how likely were they to receive a lupus diagnosis that was not previously recorded in the patient's medical record, compared to the patients who received a positive result with the conventional testing approach. we saw a 6-fold difference there, in that the odds that you would get a new lupus diagnosis with our test was 6-fold greater than it was with the conventional testing approach, which goes to show that the test, we've demonstrated in a series of studies, is more sensitive, more accurate for lupus diagnosis. This is then kind of taking the next step and showing that when clinicians use the test, it actually does translate into clinical decision making in terms of making a diagnosis. On the other hand, we also showed that when it came to treatment decisions, that the patients with the AVISE test were 3 times more likely to start a lupus medication than those who tested positive with the conventional approach. So it also was showing up in the way that patients were being managed.
Nice. No, that's really great. And just to even simplify it further for most people listening out there and don't know what lupus is basically in what they call an autoimmune illness, where basically your body attacks its own cells and stuff. So it's quite life changing, because imagine the immune system you have, which is meant to fight other illnesses, attacking you. So that's really great, and I'm happy to hear that. So, like, this brings me like to the next question, really, because I know, like, at Exagen, you got. I tried to count the tests you have, so I know you got 4 diagnostic tests, you got 2 prognostic tests, and you got 3 monitoring tests. Is any of those like one of for lupus, or if there is not one for lupus, is it something that you have in your R&D right now? And yeah, just to get just to question you a little bit about the test that you have available for people listening, in case if they want to know if you already have something on the market that also is working for lupus.
Yeah. So the most commonly utilized test from us is what's known as AVISE CTD, which stands for connective tissue disease. And CTD, or connective tissue disease, is a broad category of conditions. And specifically the ones that are addressed with our panel are lupus, which can affect a variety of different connective tissues, as you mentioned. Rheumatoid arthritis, which is one of the more common ones that folks are familiar with. But we also look at other conditions as well, like systemic sclerosis, mixed connective tissue disease, antiphospholipid syndrome, among others. And so our main panel is actually a pretty comprehensive test that's meant for patients who are referred from primary care to a specialty rheumatologist, typically with a positive anti-nuclear antibody test, or ANA. This is often an early sign that a patient may have an autoimmune disease. Many individuals who have a positive ANA don't necessarily have autoimmune disease, but that's something that needs to be evaluated and assessed by a rheumatologist to definitively rule in or rule out an autoimmune condition. But to your point, we also have other diagnostic tests. For example, we have a panel that addresses small vessel vasculitis, or ANCA-associated vasculitis, as it's known. It's another form of a chronic autoimmune disease that affects and causes inflammation in the blood vessels, particularly the small blood vessels like capillaries that permeate a lot of our organs and such. It can be a very devastating condition. And so testing is really important there. And then to your point, we have tests that help to address prognosis. So most of the conditions that we help with our diagnostic tests are chronic in nature, meaning you're never really cured from things like lupus or RA. The best that can happen is that you can get managed very well, such that the disease kind of goes into a remission or a low level of disease activity. So our tests are there to help to kind of signal to the clinician those patients that are at greatest risk for certain types of organ involvement. And then we have our monitoring tools that help to guide the clinician in understanding how active a patient's disease is, and then also helping clinicians test for therapeutic drug level exposure. So patients who are given drugs to manage their lupus or their RA, we have testing that helps the clinician understand just how much of that drug is in the patient's system and whether it's at a therapeutic level or not.
Nice. And just a quick question as well. When you talk about these tests, are they test kits or are they tests that need to work with certain machines? What do the test kits look like in case anyone is listening and they're wondering, okay, maybe this sounds like something we could make use of, and want to know the size or the utilization of it because it seems quite impactful and quite accurate, and and I'm sure it's also quicker because the world we live in, particularly when you're sick, like time is money, every single second counts, and the sooner someone gets a diagnosis or even before the symptoms really arise, that means they can even get treated better and and keep that illness in remission. So yeah, so like what do you guys test kits look like from the smallest one to the largest one, out of curiosity?
It's a good question. So we have a single laboratory here in the U.S. We're in Southern California, and we have a test kit that goes out to rheumatology offices across the United States. And what it entails is a very simple process by which we just need 2 tubes of blood. It's about 20 mLs, 20 milliliters of blood, which is, a couple of tablespoons of blood. It's not very much at all. And with this, we can run somewhere between 24 and 36 different diagnostic blood tests. So we make good use of what is a small amount of blood. So it's very simple and easy for patients. So rheumatologists will order the test on patients that they're evaluating for a suspected autoimmune condition. Those kits get shipped back to our lab by priority overnight delivery. So we get the samples the very next day, and then we process these tests typically on the order of our kind of guaranteed turnaround time is 5 business days, but our average turnaround time is around 3 days. So we've built up a lot of trust and value in the eyes of clinicians by, like you said, getting answers quickly back to the patient and to the doctor so they can inform their diagnosis and treatment management decisions going forward.
Nice, nice. That's really exciting, and I'm sure the majority of my listeners, well, about almost 27% of my listeners, are all based in the US when it comes to the audio alone. So I'm sure they're happy to hear that. But for the remaining, so obviously be asking questions in terms of like, are you guys, do you have anything for patients outside of the US? What are your plans for that, or do all shipments need to come to the US? And if that's the case, how do you guys handle the logistics? But just to start, basically, do you also cater for non-US market, or are you predominantly US market at the moment?
So the commercial diagnostic testing is mostly in the U.S. However, we are looking at potential opportunities to move into Europe, potentially into South America as well. And part of this involves us, identifying partner labs. So part of our testing that is an important consideration here is that we're testing with our proprietary biomarkers something that's on live cells. So we're doing a particular form of analysis known as flow cytometry, where you sort of look at the different proteins that are on a cell surface. And so they need to be intact for that to happen, which means the blood needs to be relatively fresh. It can't be frozen. So that makes the international kind of model with a single laboratory that we have currently difficult to manage. However, we are looking at ways in which we can partner with labs in other countries and increase the accessibility of our testing. Now, some of our testing, particularly the testing for autoantibodies, that's something that can be done in frozen plasma or frozen serum that's taken from the blood. And with that, we do have some international business relationships with what's known as contract research organizations or CROs. where we, Exagen, will be contracted to perform certain laboratory testing, often in conjunction with a phase 2 or phase 3 investigational new drug trial. And so we do some of this now, where we'll receive frozen specimens from Europe, from Asia, all over the world, and we perform testing, and that data goes in as part of these pharmaceutical trials, their data package that goes to the FDA and other regulatory bodies across the world.
Nice, nice. That's good. So and I'm sure that means everyone can use one form of the testing, regardless of where you are. And that makes a lot of sense because obviously with blood, it's a special type of like emulsion, as I would call it. So it's a mixture of many things, and its properties are quite unique. So when you freeze it, certain things change. But yeah, that's really exciting. So then, like in one sentence, if someone asked you like what is Exagen about, like what would you say? Just to summarize all the information you've said.
We are looking to provide answers for patients and the providers who are evaluating them, managing them in the realm of autoimmune rheumatic diseases. There's a lot of overlap in these conditions, and our testing helps the clinician sort of differentiate one condition from another, even when the clinical signs and symptoms might be quite related to one another.
Nice, nice. Now that's really exciting and like unknown to many people. Just a quick like just a background info is that I also worked in a lab before, but this lab was particularly for this COVID test essentially, so PCR and stuff. So and a lot of that work goes into whether in vitro diagnostic testing kits, etc., and all those equipment you need. So the tests was sometimes patients perhaps don't really understand the level of equipment that's needed for them. They just donate, one sample, and it's just a small little tube they can ship off. But when it gets to the lab, it goes through several machines to make sure you get those diagnostics, and that's some of the logistics that Exagen will be looking for when it comes to partnering with another lab to make sure that they have the right equipment, the right space, and also to train the staff as well to make sure that the tests accuracy remains as high as they already have in the US. So I just say that to give people a quick background of what the lab actually looks like. But a lot of people will be like, why does it take so long? I only sent you I sent it by the mailbox, and it's actually quite a huge complex system from entry until they leave the lab. So and everything. So it's quite exciting. Yeah, so then continuing, then I would ask you in terms of like what does the diagnosis, prognosis, and management of autoimmune conditions look like? I mean, like how do you guys do all this?
Well, it's a challenge in that, again, if you start with the diagnosis, many patients have non-specific symptoms that are shared in common with multiple different, end diagnoses. So, for example, one feature of autoimmune diseases is that patients will have a chronic, prolonged, unexplained low-grade fever. So this isn't from getting a cold or having a flu or anything like that, but it's the inflammation in the body itself that's sort of persisting chronically at a low level. It causes you to run a bit of a temperature chronically. Again, most folks probably aren't aware of this unless they're checking their temperature every day. Uh, so that's one example. Another example of this is, patients have what's known as arthralgias, which is sort of sounds like arthritis, but it's a little bit different. So arthralgias is sort of the achiness, your joints are a little bit, sore and stiff in the morning, and you're not really sure why. Is it maybe because I, ran around a lot, the other day, or, spend too much time in the gym, things like this. But over time, that's something that, if it persists, could be a sign that you have some low grade inflammation that's occurring, and it's not specific. There's many different forms of arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis is the one folks probably know the best, but you can have psoriatic arthritis, which is entirely different. You can have, other factors that could be contributing to pain in your joints. For example, gout, which is a metabolic condition where you get, crystals that, form within the joints, and it becomes, sort of painful and causes the joints to swell and things like this. But ultimately, diagnosis is all about differentiating amongst a complex set of signs and symptoms, usually aided by diagnostic testing that is coupled with that physical exam or that physical evaluation in the mind of the rheumatologist to ultimately determine what a patient has. Rheumatology is a little bit unique relative to, say, oncology, where very often with cancer, there's, a biopsy that can be performed where you can know with very high certainty that a patient has not just lung cancer, but they have this particular form of lung cancer. That doesn't really exist in rheumatology. There are certain, biopsies that can be performed and such, but largely it's a clinical diagnosis informed by laboratory testing, family history, and what the clinician is seeing on physical exam. So that's where our testing is important. We're providing something better, something that's more sensitive and accurate to the clinician. And then once a patient's diagnosed, then management becomes the focus going forward. What's the right medication for the patient? What's the right intensity of their medication? And how is that going to evolve over time? It's probably not well understood by most unless they live with something, a condition like this. But take lupus as an example. We don't have a ton of medications to treat lupus. There are some, but perhaps one of the most effective is corticosteroids, which dampen the immune system and therefore kind of hold the disease in check, where otherwise your immune system would be attacking healthy tissue and causing inflammation and damage. Corticosteroids are very effective at blunting that activity. The problem is corticosteroids at high doses over long periods of time are toxic. And so that has to be very carefully managed by the clinician to ensure that someone's not put at undue risk as they're being managed.
Nice, nice. That's really exciting to hear in terms of how things are. And like it's the management is quite unique, because in terms of you need special medication, and obviously there's a medication, there's steroids you're talking about, there's a sort of like medicines that help with the pain as well, but also they are prescription. So like you only get them from your doctor. You can't just walk into a local pharmacy and get them. So that also helps in terms of managing them, managing the illness, making sure that there's no abuse in the use of substance, particularly for this medication. And it makes me wonder in terms of like, how do you think, like, how increasingly impactful, like, has research.
So yes, the research is constantly evolving, and we do have a much better understanding of autoimmune conditions than we did even 20, 25 years ago. Around that time is when around the early 2000s is when biologics first became sort of a mainstay of treatment for many autoimmune conditions. Biologics are very often antibodies or proteins that are meant to sort of act or function like antibodies that can help target very, very precisely specific proteins within the body that are imbalanced in autoimmune diseases. So one of the most common ones that most folks are probably aware of is Humira. This is a drug that is a antibody to a protein known as tumor necrosis factor, and this is something that revolutionized the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, and it has become one of the most widely used drugs in the world. And so that's an example of how the decades and decades of research leading up to that moment led to an entirely new way of treating patients, where now we're putting antibodies into patients that can sort of very precisely target certain parts of the immune system that become dysregulated and lead to autoimmune conditions. Having said that, there's still a lot of work to be done. Autoimmune diseases are famously complex because the immune system itself is a very complicated system that sort of acts like a carefully coordinated orchestra, where you have many different elements playing different tunes and at different levels. And when things go out of balance, it's not as simple as just replacing this protein or removing this protein from the system. That has unintended consequences that aren't always obvious at first. And so untangling the web of autoimmunity and how the immune system becomes unregulated and how we can bring it back into balance, that's the future in terms of further evolving our understanding. But it will take a lot of time, investment, and research for us to get there.
Nice, makes sense. I think that explains a lot in terms of because there's a lot of illnesses today that perhaps would have killed you centuries ago or even 50 years ago. But the evolution of a combination of many things, not just pharmaceutical drugs, but even also medical devices that have enabled certain tests to be done, certain drugs to be developed, has also increased. So I'm quite curious to pick your brain on that one.
Absolutely. So I guess when I look forward, 5-10 years in terms of where this is all going, I look to oncology in a sense, in that you look at how oncology has evolved over the past 2 or 3 decades to now, where we have very, very targeted treatments, not just for lung cancer, but for non-small cell lung cancer, and even within that, patients who have very specific genetic mutations that are driving their cancer. We have very, very precise ways of testing to understand with great detail what type of cancer you have, even once the sort of main category is established, what the subtype is and what's driving the condition. We're not quite there with autoimmune diseases and rheumatology, but the hope is that we can adopt the model that oncology has, where we not just develop very, very precise drugs that can target very, very specific proteins within the broader system, but we also have accompanying tests that help most effectively deploy and utilize those drugs where the patient has the greatest probability of responding to the drug. Unfortunately, we have very good drugs in rheumatology at this point. Rheumatoid arthritis is probably the best example. There's at least 5 or 6 major mechanisms of action that can be targeted with various different, current generation drugs. However, we don't have a very good way of precisely targeting those drugs to the individual. So this is all often talked about in terms of, personalized medicine or precision medicine. That's where I hope rheumatology can go here in the next, 10, 15 years. And that's going to be a big role for testing to play in making all of that happen. And then lastly, to your kind of other question about, how does, advancements in machine learning, computing, et cetera, play into all of this? It's here already, in that we have massive amounts of data now that we have access to through studies that we do, through registries, through proteomic screening platforms we have, where we can measure thousands of proteins at once from a single patient sample. The only way to reduce that data down to something that's meaningful is to use machine learning, a process where you have a computer learn about some of the patterns or tendencies that exist within the data, and it helps to make predictions based on what it learns from the data. We're using that now in development. Others are as well. That'll be a huge opportunity for all of us to kind of take the next step here with making our tests even more accurate, more precise, and more useful to the clinician.
Nice, nice. And I couldn't help but think with everything you said, is there like how also is this going to be linked into personalized medicines? Do you think there'll ever be a point where everyone will have their own set of test kits, maybe whether it's for food, so they know that this food will be allergic to me before they've even had the food, etc. Kind of personalizing that kind of medicine, sort of like taking that direction where people now have like individual test kits they can carry around for their specific kind of conditions and everything. But I don't know. Do you think that will ever be a possibility, or is it something that perhaps will be too hard and complex to do?
Well, I'm not sure that we're all going to be testing ourselves for um, everything. And really, if you think about it from um, I know this isn't a statistics podcast, but if you think about it from a
Yeah.
statistical perspective, it's actually not a good idea to just sort of indiscriminately test yourself for things that you don't have symptoms for, because um, even when tests are very, very accurate, there's always some degree of a false positive rate. And so
Yes.
if you start testing for everything, you'll find that you will test positive for some things, but if you don't have the clinical, signs and symptoms to go along with it, then it probably isn't meaningful. So, but what I do think will happen, to your point, is we will refine our testing, hopefully in conjunction with refining how we diagnose and refining how we treat conditions. So these things all should move kind of hand in hand, ideally, in that as our treatments get better, we have a better way of targeting those treatments. As we have better, molecular tests or better proteomic tests that kind of delineate subtypes of conditions, we're better equipped to align treatment with those subtypes. So I view these three things as very much kind of connected, from how we're diagnosing, how we're treating, and how we're testing. It's almost like a spider web that as you pull on one, the other kind of moves as well. So um, I think that's the end goal, is to kind of harmonize those three features together to lead to better outcomes for patients.
Nice, nice. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast today. I think that was quite informative and quite exciting. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rodney. It was great to be here.